here in person, but is going to be speaking online. So I hope that he is already connected. Is he already connected?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark Williams, who is the manager of the practice manager digital development at the World Bank. And kindly take the floor and go ahead, please, Mr. Mark Williams.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting and important conference. My name's, as the Chair has mentioned, my name is Mark Williams. I lead the Research and Policy Division in the World Bank that focuses on digital development. And we've, across the World Bank, we've been doing quite extensive research into artificial intelligence and how it can be implemented in developing countries and what the effects of artificial intelligence are likely to be from both an economic and a social perspective. So I'm going to just share a few slides on research, summarizing research around the economic impacts of artificial intelligence, and then talk a little bit about potential policy implications for developing countries, particularly in Africa. I'm going to share my screen. Let me check that you can all see it. Chair, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So first of all, artificial intelligence. What's going to be the effect of artificial intelligence on economies globally as well as in developing countries? Well, the first thing to appreciate is that artificial intelligence can be thought of as a general purpose technology. So it's a technology which is of very wide use. It can be adapted and used in all sorts of different ways, and therefore creates a platform technology which affects the whole of manufacturing, economic activity, and social activity. And as a general purpose technology, we expect it to disrupt broad areas of economies in both high-income countries and developing countries. But having said that, the evidence on this is still quite limited. Artificial intelligence is still at an early stage of rollout, and certainly in developing countries, particularly in Africa, it's had quite limited uptake to date. But we can think of the effect of artificial intelligence in three different ways. We can think of its effect on the labor markets, we can think of its effect on firms, and we can think of its effect on trade. And in all these areas, AI is going to have both economic and social implications. First of all, let's just think a little bit more about what AI is doing in the economy. We can think of it as having three different significant effects. The first is the productivity effect. The second is a distributional effect. And then third one, I would call other externalities or other non-economic or effects that are not directly economic. So I'll talk a little bit about each of those three. First one is around productivity. So AI is a technology which augments the factors of production. So when AI is introduced into existing capital, it improves the productivity of that capital. And similarly, when it's linked with labor, it improves the productivity of that labor. And it has an effect of both raising the output of those factors of production, but also creates new opportunities for innovation, new products, new services, and extending of existing products into new areas. So those are the very general productivity effects that AI is expected to have. Now, on the distribution side, if we think about what the effects of AI are going to be on individuals, we think about labor, which is currently doing jobs which can be replaced by AI technologies. Those tasks and those jobs eventually will get replaced by AI, not everywhere, but in many cases they will. But for jobs which are not replaceable by AI, it has the potential to raise the productivity of those jobs, so actually increase demand for those types of that type of employment. At the firm level, we're expecting AI to enhance productivity of firms and also generate a huge amount of value. But the question would be, from a social and an economic policy point of view, is how is that value distributed? Is it true that the originators of AI, which would be mainly in the US, Europe, and in China, which control the patents on it, would they retain much of the value, or would that value be distributed more broadly around developing countries? And then finally, what's going to be the pattern of effect of AI on countries? How is it going to change country competitiveness? How is it going to change the terms of trade between developing and high-income countries? And what are the implications of that at the macro level? And then our final category of effect is around what we call other externalities. So issues around privacy, ethics, and decision-making, policy decision-making, which has already been mentioned so far, and I'm sure will be explored in a lot more detail in the rest of the colloquium. So the effect on workers, we can think of AI as an extension of an existing effect, which is the effect of automation and technology, which of course has been underway for many decades. And what we see is that even in rich countries, AI, well, first of all, automation and robots have been replacing jobs at a rapid rate. And AI is an extension of that, and it's going to have a similar effect, but in new areas of the labor market. And what are those areas of the labor market which AI, as opposed to robots, is going to affect? Well, it's most likely to affect better paid, better educated workers, particularly those in the service industry, which up to now they were not undertaking mechanical tasks, so they were not at threat of being replacement by automation. But AI is capable of replicating many of those tasks and therefore replacing those jobs. So AI is having a job displacement effect, and it's also having this productivity effect. And it's the balance between these two which determines the aggregate effect, economic effect of AI, but also the distributional effect of it. If we think about business models behind AI technology, first of all, the originators of the technology are really heavily concentrated in North America, as I mentioned, Europe and China. So the control over the underlying technology, or the licensing of that, sits within those regions. But if we think about the value chain, the AI value chain as a whole, that's at the top, at the most upstream point. Actually, these are multiple different stages in the value chain that converts underlying AI intellectual property into products which are sold to customers or are used in governments. And it's a pattern of business models development in each of those value chains, each of those stages of the value chain, which will determine where the value is retained as AI develops and propagates through around the world. This is still a very open question. The history of related areas of business, like digital platforms, is one of extreme concentration, and where value has been retained in the originating countries. In this case, again, the US and China. So this is something that we as policymakers and researchers, we need to be very conscious of when we think about the potential future distributional effects of AI. And then we think about what AI is going to happen, what the effect of AI is going to be at the aggregate level, particularly through considerations of trade. What we see is AI is substituting, we've already seen automation substituting for labor in many manufacturing processes. And AI is extending this process, and it's also extending it within the manufacturing industry, but also into the service industry. So that's having two effects. One is it changes the balance between the relevance of factors of production between labor and capital. So countries which have built a business, a trade, an export industry based around labor costs arbitrage, where they've been able to use cheap labor in their country to export to high-income countries. As AI further replaces those tasks currently undertaken by workers, the rationale for outsourcing or offshoring production becomes less, and it means companies, organizations in the destination countries are more likely to reshore. The second thing is AI is spreading into new areas of the economy. So I mentioned before the service sector. So many developing countries have built industries around call centers and business process offshoring. And much of those tasks, and that was again a labor cost arbitrage, most of those tasks are doable by AI. So that has the potential to hit those segments of the economy in those developing countries very significantly. So what do we think, given the lack of evidence, what are our expectations about the impact of AI on developing countries? Well, we can think about this in the short run, medium term, and in the long run. In the short run, we think the effect is going to be relatively limited because rates of AI adoption are relatively low, and we haven't seen much impact on the job market as yet. And it takes time for these technologies to feed through into those other macro effects. In the medium term, we would expect to see significant disruption in the labor markets in some countries. And in the long run, potentially AI is cutting off traditional routes for development, economic development for developing countries. So for example, moving from agriculture through to manufacturing, through to services. The manufacturing stage of that process may be more difficult for many countries and could lead to premature deindustrialization. So if we think about the policy implications of this for Africa, well, the biggest challenge for Africa in this context is going to be the rapid growth, sustained growth in the working age population that's expected in Africa. And that working age population is going to need jobs. Now, AI is potentially replacing many of those jobs that would have otherwise been, could have otherwise absorbed the surplus labor. So this is going to be a big challenge for Africa going forward. And another consideration, which is the education and skill levels of the workforce within Africa. One of the features of AI as an extension of technology more generally is you're seeing a bifurcation of the demand for jobs. You're seeing demand for low-skilled jobs, and you're seeing demand for high-skilled jobs. And it's the middle level of skills which is being replaced by technology, and AI will continue that process. So the result for developing countries, particularly in Africa, is that it has significant implications for demand for and the need for education and skills within the workforce, something which is which takes a long time to develop. And then a second application is going to be infrastructure. AI, of course, is dependent on digital infrastructure, both the capacity of it and the coverage of it and the usage of it. So again, regions which have got limited broadband and cloud and digital infrastructure are going to be at a disadvantage when it comes to adoption of AI. But there are some positive reasons for optimism as well. If we look at historical other general purpose technologies, for example, electricity, what we saw is that though there were countries which originated the technology in the first place. In the case of electricity, Europe and the US, the same could be said of the telephone. But the technology spread extremely quickly. And if you look historically back at those general purpose technologies, actually the users benefited more in the aggregate than the originators. So AI is becoming what we would call productized. So from original patents and original underlying technology, it's being turned into products, and those products are being sold mid-supply chain products, and those products are being sold into developing countries, and you're seeing rapid take-up in certain segments of the economy in certain countries. The cloud business model, which of course is becoming very important, gives access to storage and processing capacity even outside countries, outside the countries where the user is. And that's creating lots of opportunities. And so what we're seeing is the growth of AI-based companies within Africa. And what they're doing is they are adapting underlying AI technology, but for the local context. And so there are reasons to be optimistic about the way AI can be used and create jobs and wealth in developing countries. So what do the policymakers need to focus on? And this is a very broad, high-level view, but I would just say there are 4 areas where policymakers need to focus. First of all is on infrastructure. If a country does not have sufficient digital infrastructure, it's going to be completely cut out of the AI value chain, both as an innovator, but also as a consumer. And what will happen is the effects of AI will happen, but they will happen around that country, which won't be able to get any value out of it. So that's the first point. The second point is around skills. Technology innovation and AI particularly has significant implications for the skill requirements. And this is expensive and it takes a long time to implement. So policymakers, this is becoming an increasing priority for policymakers if they're not to see severe impact on their labour markets over the decades to come. Legal and regulatory issues are key. We've heard about these already, and I'm sure there'll be more discussion of it during this conference. The legal and regulatory issues in the way that AI is adopted and used, but also as the way that, as a way of encouraging AI adoption within organizations in those countries, is going to be an important driver of how AI, the value generated by AI, is distributed. And then finally, innovation. As I mentioned, there are lots of reasons to be optimistic about the way AI can feed into innovation and job and firm creation in developing countries. But this is not done in a vacuum, and policymakers need to support that innovation ecosystem if their countries are going to reap adequate benefits from the technology. Thank you, Madam Chair. Back to you.
Thank you so much.